It's an honor to greet you today. As we gather in this moment, it's important to understand the spiritual power of worship. Worship isn't just a routine or a ritual we engage in. It's an intimate and transformative act that connects us to the very heart of God. But what many don't realize is that worship, when misdirected or misunderstood, can open doors to spiritual forces that we may not even be aware of. Today, we're going to explore a crucial topic: how the enemy uses worship to enter our lives and cause harm. Many of us approach worship with good intentions, but there is a hidden danger we need to recognize. The enemy knows that our worship is powerful, and when we worship improperly, we unknowingly invite demonic forces into our lives. Through this message, you will learn how to protect your worship and avoid the pitfalls that many fall into. Before we dive deeper into this subject, make sure to like and subscribe to stay connected with powerful teachings and insights that will strengthen your spiritual walk. God has great things in store for you. Worship is not just an act. It is the deepest form of connection with the Creator. When we engage in worship, we do more than simply sing songs or attend a service. We open ourselves to a spiritual experience that reaches beyond the physical world. Worship is, in its purest form, a surrender, a submission to the greatness and sovereignty of God. It is an offering, a moment when we place ourselves before the throne of God and acknowledge His position as King and Creator. Worship is a vehicle for God's presence to fill our hearts, our homes, and our churches. Through worship, we declare, "You are Lord, and I am your servant." Yet, many are unaware that worship is a double-edged sword. Yes, it can bring us closer to God, but it also has the potential to attract unwanted spiritual influences. While worship is meant to be a direct connection with God, there are forces at work that seek to pervert and distort this experience. The enemy understands the power of worship and knows that it is in these moments of intimate connection with God that he can quietly enter into our lives. His goal is to distort our worship so that it no longer glorifies God, but instead serves his purposes. This is where the danger lies. Most people do not realize that worship is not just about what happens during the song service. It is not limited to the physical act of singing, clapping, or raising hands. Worship is a spiritual exchange. It's a declaration, an invitation, and a powerful moment of agreement. It is when we choose to honor God with all our hearts, minds, and souls. But here is the reality. If our hearts are not truly aligned with God's will, the enemy can sneak in, diverting our worship from being an offering to God to being a ritual or practice where we unwittingly glorify something else. Take, for example, the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. When they were journeying through the desert, they were frequently caught in cycles of turning to idolatry. Their worship, which should have been directed toward God, began to focus on the golden calf, a clear example of how distorted worship can lead to idolatry. In this moment, the very act that was meant to honor God became a means of spiritual distraction, and the enemy had an open door. They were worshiping, but not God. This is what happens when worship becomes more about the emotion, the ritual, or the experience rather than the one who deserves all honor and glory. We must understand that worship is an invitation to spiritual warfare. It is a moment when the spirit realm is most active, whether we recognize it or not. When we worship, we are literally standing in the midst of a cosmic struggle. Our praises either invite the presence of God or give way to forces of darkness. We are continually engaged in a battle for the direction of our hearts. Our worship is either an offering of surrender to God, or it becomes a vessel that can attract unwanted spirits. This is why we must be discerning in our worship, ensuring that our hearts remain pure and fully directed toward the Lord. The enemy knows that worship is a powerful entry point, which is why he works tirelessly to twist our understanding of it. Think about the church today. Many are caught up in the emotional experiences of worship, the lights, the music, the atmosphere. But what happens when the music fades and the lights dim? What happens when the heart is left unguarded? It is easy to get caught up in the emotional highs of worship, but God wants our worship to be a reflection of our hearts, not a momentary experience. True worship is consistent, lasting, and rooted in the reverence of God. It is about continually honoring Him, no matter the circumstances or feelings that come and go. This is where many fall short. They mistake the emotional experience for the substance of worship. Worship is not about how you feel. It's about who God is and who you are in Him. It's not about the music or the atmosphere. It's about your heart and your submission to His will. When our worship becomes focused on anything other than God, we open the door for the enemy to enter and corrupt it. It is in these moments that spiritual forces can subtly begin to influence our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. Worship is also meant to be a personal experience. While corporate worship is powerful and important, true worship must begin in the heart of each individual. It is when we are alone with God that we are most vulnerable. This is why the enemy loves to infiltrate our private worship times. He knows that if he can distract us in our most intimate moments with God, he can gain control of our thoughts and actions. This is why we must be vigilant and intentional about guarding our hearts during times of worship. As we grow in our understanding of worship, we must learn to recognize the power it holds, both for good and for evil. The devil has always sought to distort the things of God, and worship is no exception. We must not allow our worship to become a mere formality, a routine, or a performance. Our worship should be a reflection of our hearts, a deep, intimate expression of our love and reverence for God. When we understand the power of worship, we will be better equipped to guard our hearts and ensure that our worship remains pure, honoring God above all else. Worship is a powerful spiritual force. It is more than an act of devotion or a ritual performed in churches. It is the gateway through which spiritual forces either enter or are shut out of our lives. When we engage in worship, we are participating in a spiritual battle that transcends the physical realm. This battle is not simply about feelings or emotions. It is about spiritual territory. Worship is not neutral. It is a battleground for the soul. From the beginning of time, worship has been the arena of spiritual warfare. Lucifer, once the highest archangel, fell from grace because of his desire to be worshipped. His rebellion against God began in the heart, with the desire to exalt himself above the Creator. Lucifer's fall serves as a vivid reminder of the power worship holds. If the enemy can tempt someone as powerful as Lucifer to fall through the desire for worship, how much more vulnerable are we, mere humans, when we do not guard our hearts during times of worship? The enemy's strategy is simple but effective: distract, distort, and redirect. Worship is the key to everything, the key to unlocking God's presence in our lives. So, the enemy's first move is to deceive us about the true nature of worship. He wants us to think of worship as merely an emotional experience or a public display rather than a heartfelt surrender to God. When we begin to worship for the wrong reasons, whether it's for performance, self-gratification, or recognition, we open the door for the enemy to step in. The spirit of deception enters, distorting the very reason for worship, which is to glorify God. The Bible is filled with examples of spiritual warfare, but one of the most telling accounts is the story of the Israelites as they marched into battle. In 2 Chronicles 20, King Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah were faced with an overwhelming army, but God instructed them to send worshippers ahead of the army. The worshippers went out, singing praises to God, declaring his greatness and power. And as they worshipped, God intervened supernaturally, causing their enemies to turn on each other and defeat themselves. This act of worship was more than a song. It was a declaration of God's authority and a defiance of the enemy's power. Worship was the weapon that won the battle. When we worship, we are engaging in a spiritual battle. It is not just about singing songs. It is about positioning ourselves in the Spirit, declaring that we belong to God and that no weapon formed against us will prosper. However, in this warfare, we must be aware of the enemy's tactics. He does not always come with obvious temptations or attacks. Sometimes he works through subtle distractions, encouraging us to focus on how the worship makes us feel or how others might perceive us. He knows that if he can shift our focus, we will miss the deeper spiritual significance of worship. Our hearts become less about honoring God and more about ourselves. This is how the enemy operates, by shifting our focus and stealing the very thing that was meant to be a weapon against him. The Apostle Paul warns us in Ephesians 6:12 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and the rulers of the darkness of this world. This tells us that the battle is not just physical, it is spiritual. Worship is not an isolated activity. It is part of the ongoing spiritual battle for our hearts and minds. And if we are not vigilant, we will miss the reality of what is happening in the spirit realm. Worship, when done in spirit and truth, is the ultimate weapon in spiritual warfare. It is a means of declaring that God's kingdom is established and that we, his children, belong to him. The enemy cannot stand against true worship, for it reminds him of his defeat and the victory of the cross. But if we are not careful, we may be unknowingly inviting the enemy into our lives during worship. This is why we must keep our hearts pure and our focus on God. When we worship with sincerity, with our hearts fully aligned with his will, we become more than conquerors through Christ. Worship becomes not just an act of praise, but a declaration of war against the enemy. As we engage in worship, we must always remember that we are not passive participants. We are soldiers in God's army, and worship is one of the most powerful tools we have in our spiritual arsenal. The enemy is constantly on the prowl, seeking to destroy, but when we worship in truth and spirit, we are positioned for victory. This victory is not just in the physical realm, but in the spiritual battles that rage behind the scenes. In closing, we must recognize that every time we enter into worship, we are stepping onto a battlefield, but we do not fight alone. We fight with the power of God's presence in our lives. We fight with the assurance that the victory has already been won on the cross. Worship is our declaration of that victory, and as we engage in it with pure hearts, we declare that the enemy has no place in our lives. The enemy is a master of subtlety. He does not always come in with a loud, dramatic entrance. Instead, he sneaks in slowly, unnoticed, under the guise of something that seems harmless. This is the essence of spiritual deception. The devil does not always come as the obvious villain. Sometimes he enters through the most unsuspecting doors, and worship is one of those doors. When we talk about demonic infiltration, we often think of overt, dramatic manifestations. Demonic possessions, violent outbursts, or sudden calamities. While these things do happen, they are rarely how the enemy works in the lives of believers. More often, the enemy works through gradual, unnoticed means, subtly shifting our thoughts, desires, and affections until we find ourselves far removed from God's purpose for our lives. This subtlety is most dangerous in worship because worship is meant to be a direct connection to God. However, if our hearts are not aligned properly, the enemy can slip in unnoticed, distorting our worship and ultimately our relationship with God. Let's think about the story of the fall of Lucifer. In Isaiah 14:12-15, we learn that Lucifer was once a beautiful, powerful archangel created to serve and worship God. But the moment pride entered his heart, his worship shifted from being focused on God to being centered on himself. He desired to exalt his throne above that of God, and this desire led to his downfall. Lucifer's fall didn't happen overnight. It began with a small seed of pride, which eventually grew into rebellion. This story serves as a warning for us. The enemy works subtly, first planting small seeds of discontent or distraction in our hearts. These seeds, if left unchecked, can grow into something far more dangerous. When we come into God's presence, our worship should be about Him and Him alone. But sometimes we begin to worship the experience, how we feel during worship, the music, the atmosphere, or even the approval of others around us. Worship is no longer an offering to God, but a means of self-gratification. This is where the subtlety of demonic infiltration comes in. The enemy doesn't need to possess us or cause a dramatic event. He simply needs to shift our focus. Worship is no longer about the object of our devotion, God, but about our own desires, emotions, and needs. And when this shift occurs, the enemy has found a foothold. The enemy doesn't need our full attention. He simply needs us to be distracted, to be off course, even slightly. Over time, this subtle deviation from true worship can lead us far away from God. One example of this subtle infiltration can be seen in the story of King Saul. Saul was anointed by God to be king over Israel, but his disobedience in worship eventually led to his downfall. When Saul offered sacrifices to God in 1 Samuel 13, he did so out of a desire to appease the people and to save his own reputation. His act of worship was no longer about obedience to God. It was about self-preservation. In this moment, Saul unknowingly opened the door for the enemy to work in his life, ultimately leading to his rejection by God. This is why we must guard our hearts during worship. The enemy loves to operate in the shadows, and when we are not fully aware, he can subtly shift our focus. Worship is an offering, and it must be a sincere act of surrender. If we are not careful, we can slip into a place where our worship is no longer pure, but tainted with pride, distraction, or idolatry. When this happens, we open the door for the enemy to enter, slowly eroding the true connection we have with God. We must also recognize that the enemy often uses our strengths and desires against us. He uses our love for God, our desire to serve Him, and our longing for a deeper connection to subtly lead us astray. This is why we must remain vigilant in our worship, keeping our hearts centered on God and His glory. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that our worship is pleasing to God when, in reality, it may be focused more on our own needs or desires than on His will. The Bible warns us to guard our hearts, for out of it flow the issues of life. Proverbs 4:23. This is especially true in worship. We must examine our hearts before God and ensure that our worship is directed toward Him alone. When we allow the enemy to subtly infiltrate our worship, we risk losing the purity and power of our connection with God. But when we guard our hearts and worship in spirit and truth, we create a space where God's presence can dwell, and the enemy has no place. One of the most insidious ways that the enemy gains access through worship is through the introduction of idols. Idolatry is not just the act of bowing down to statues or images. It is anything that takes the place of God in our hearts and minds. When we allow anything or anyone to take the position of God in our lives, we are engaging in idolatry, and it is one of the most effective ways the enemy can disrupt our worship. Worship is meant to be an act of surrender, a complete offering of ourselves to God. It is an intimate connection with our Creator, where we acknowledge His sovereignty and grace. However, when we begin to allow other things to take priority over God, whether it be fame, fortune, relationships, or even our own desires, we begin to turn our worship away from God and toward these idols. And this is exactly where the enemy wants us. He wants us to worship anything other than God, because it is through idolatry that we allow the door to be opened for demonic influence in our lives. The Bible is full of warnings about idolatry, especially in the context of worship. In Exodus 20:3-5, God commands, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." This command is not just a call to avoid physical idols. It is a call to avoid giving our hearts to anything that would usurp God's rightful place in our lives. Idolatry is a heart issue. When our worship is not centered on God, but on something else, whether it is the desire for approval, success, or comfort, we are no longer worshiping God in truth. The danger of idolatry in worship is that it is often subtle. The things we idolize in our hearts may not seem harmful on the surface. We may even feel justified in our pursuits, believing that these things are necessary for our well-being. But when these things begin to take the place of God in our hearts, they become idols. And when we worship idols, we open ourselves up to the demonic. This is because idols are not neutral. They are not just empty objects. They are attached to spiritual forces that draw us away from God. The more we worship idols, the more we invite these spiritual forces into our lives. In 1 Kings 18, we read the story of the prophet Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. The Israelites had allowed the worship of Baal, a false god, to infiltrate their worship of the true God. Elijah stood before the people and called them to make a decision. Either worship the true God or worship the false god of Baal. The people had been torn between two masters. They had been offering their worship to Baal while claiming to follow God. And in doing so, they had opened the door to demonic influence. Elijah's challenge was simple. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. 1 Kings 18:21. The moment the Israelites chose to worship God alone, the fire of God fell, and he proved himself to be the one true God. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel serves as a powerful reminder that we cannot serve two masters. We cannot worship God while simultaneously giving our hearts to idols. Idolatry in worship is dangerous because it distorts our perception of God and weakens our relationship with Him. The more we worship idols, the more we distance ourselves from God's presence, and this opens the door for demonic influence to take root in our lives. The enemy loves to use idolatry to infiltrate worship because it shifts our focus away from God's glory and onto ourselves. Worship becomes about what we want, what we desire, and what we can gain, rather than about glorifying God. When we worship idols, whether it is our career, relationships, or personal ambitions, we are no longer worshiping God in spirit and truth. And this is when the enemy can begin to influence our thoughts, our attitudes, and our actions. Idols are not just distractions, they are gateways to demonic activity. The Bible tells us that we are to flee from idolatry, 1 Corinthians 10:14. This is not a suggestion, it is a command. Idolatry opens the door to deception, and once deception takes root, it becomes much harder to discern truth from lies. When our hearts are filled with idols, it becomes difficult to hear God's voice clearly. Our worship becomes tainted, and the enemy is able to lead us further away from God's purpose. In order to avoid this trap, we must constantly examine our hearts. Are there areas in our lives where we have placed idols, whether it be a desire for success, recognition, or even relationships? Have we allowed anything to take the place of God's rightful position in our hearts? If so, we must repent and turn back to God, ensuring that our worship is centered on Him alone. True worship is not about what we can gain or achieve. It is about giving ourselves fully to God and surrendering to His will. When we worship God with undivided hearts, free from the distractions of idols, we position ourselves to experience the fullness of His presence. We invite His Spirit to work in our lives, bringing transformation, healing, and deliverance. True worship is a weapon against the enemy. It is a declaration of God's sovereignty and an act of surrender that leaves no room for idols. And when we worship in this way, the enemy has no place in our lives. Worship is meant to be an intimate, focused experience, where we give our hearts, minds, and souls fully to God. It is a moment where we connect with our Creator, acknowledging His greatness and His sovereignty over our lives. However, one of the most effective tactics of the enemy in worship is distraction. Distraction is the subtle force that pulls our attention away from God and onto the things of the world. When we are distracted during worship, we lose the opportunity to encounter God in a meaningful way. The enemy knows that our worship is powerful. It is the place where we connect with God, where we acknowledge His power and His authority over our lives. So, if he can distract us, he can steal that moment of connection and render our worship ineffective. Distractions during worship come in many forms. Sometimes it's the noise of the world, the stresses of daily life, our concerns about the future, or the distractions of our own thoughts. Other times, it's the distractions of our own desires and expectations, as we begin to focus more on how the worship makes us feel than on the one we are worshiping. One of the greatest challenges in worship is keeping our hearts and minds fully focused on God. In Psalm 27:4, David says, "One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in His temple." David's heart was singularly focused on God. He desired to be in His presence and to behold His beauty. This is the essence of true worship, to be fully captivated by the presence of God and to allow nothing else to take our focus. However, the enemy is a master of distraction. He understands that if he can divert our attention, even for a moment, from the beauty and power of God, he can steal our worship. We may still go through the motions, singing the songs, raising our hands, and participating in the rituals, but our hearts are far from God. This is the danger of distraction in worship. It causes us to miss the very presence of God we are seeking. Jesus warned His disciples in Mark 4:19 about the dangers of distraction when He spoke about the parable of the sower. He said, "The cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." This is exactly what happens when we allow distractions to take hold of our worship. The cares of life, the desire for success, the need for approval, all of these things can easily pull our focus away from God. When this happens, our worship becomes unfruitful. We may sing the songs, but our hearts are not engaged with God. Distractions come in many forms, but they all have the same goal, to pull us away from God. Whether it's the distractions of the world or the distractions of our own desires, the enemy uses them to steal the power of worship in our lives. When we are distracted, we miss the opportunity to connect with God on a deeper level. We miss the chance to experience His presence and to be transformed by His glory. The key to overcoming distractions in worship is focus. We must train our hearts and minds to fix our attention on God alone. We must actively resist the distractions of the world and the temptations of our own desires, choosing instead to focus solely on the one we are worshiping. This requires discipline and intentionality. We must create a space for worship where distractions are minimized, where we can give our full attention to God. In practical terms, this might mean turning off our phones or other devices during worship. It might mean setting aside the worries of the day and choosing to focus on God, even in the midst of our challenges. It might mean surrendering our own desires and expectations, allowing God to move in our hearts in whatever way He chooses. When we do this, we open the door for true worship to take place, a worship that is focused, undistracted, and powerful. In conclusion, distraction is one of the enemy's most effective tools in worship. It pulls us away from the heart of God and steals the power of our connection with Him. But when we choose to focus our hearts and minds solely on God, we open the door to deeper intimacy and transformation. Worship becomes not just an act, but a powerful encounter with the living God. And when we worship with focus, we disarm the enemy and position ourselves for victory.